Aposimz is a series from Tsutomu Nihei, the author of works such as Blame, Biomega, Abara, and Knights of Sidonia. I'm a huge fan of Nihei's. His intricate and eye-catching artwork brings life to the universe that his stories inhabit. From never-ending staircases to gargantuan pipelines and endless seas of architecture, Nihei is able to develop an oppressive, dark, and foreboding atmosphere with very little dialogue in nearly all of his works. Aposimz does occasionally use atmospheric artwork to convey tone. However, it has a much stronger focus on plot than the typical Nihei story. As such, Aposimz is a much more dialogue-heavy story, and the artwork reflects this. The story is populated with tight character close-ups, even in action scenes. This is a huge departure from the wide angles Nihei typically utilizes. Nihei has abandoned his typical heavy lines and saturated blacks, and instead opted to utilize a style with very light line work, meaning the art in Aposimz is wispier, lighter, and less solid-looking. Couple this drastic departure in art style with the fact that much of Aposimz's first two volumes take place outside, as opposed to within an endless sea of buildings, and we have a Tsutomu Nihei series with a much different visual aesthetic than most of his works. The character design is also a departure from Nihei's typical style. Many of the characters that we are introduced to in the first two volumes have very round, blobby faces, giving them a cute appearance. This friendlier approach to character design comes at a steep contrast to the more violent and gruesome aspects of the series once those come into play. While the visuals were a bit of a departure from Nihei's traditional style, the writing was very similar, and yet the frequent use of dialogue meant that his method of storytelling was quite different. Aposimz is a much more dialogue-driven story than any other Nihei work I've read. Dialogue populates nearly every page, and while the terminology used can be very esoteric and difficult to parse, as is typical for a Nihei work, the character motivations were very concrete, with characters often making it very clear what they're doing and why. Never have I had a clearer grasp of the motivations of Nihei's characters, as typically Nihei's stories are much more visual, with massive intricate landscapes populating many pages. When reading a Nihei work like Blame, for example, you may encounter a series of many pages with little to no dialogue at all. This can leave a lot of room for interpretation, putting the reader in a position where what exactly is happening and why is left for them to determine. Having a more dialogue-heavy story does allow the reader to have a better grasp of the characters' motivations, to better relate to these characters, and to root for them with greater ease. However, this mode of storytelling sacrifices the visual intricacies found in other Nihei works such as Blame and Abara, and thus sacrifices the uniqueness of his visual style and the ability for unparalleled world building for a more easily accessible mode of storytelling. The primary reason why myself and many others are drawn to Nihei's works isn't so much because of the plot of his stories, but because of the visual spectacle brought about in his works. And so Aposimz does not offer the traditional mode of appeal that many fans of Nihei's may be looking for in one of his stories. In terms of the plot, Aposimz takes place on an artificial planet of the same name. Centuries prior, there was a war on Aposimz. The members of the losing side were forced to eke out their lives doing their best to survive on the planet's near desolate surface, while the winners developed an empire residing underground, determined to exert their control everywhere on the planet. Our story begins with a man named Ethero living in a small city on the surface whose people try to stay out of the empire's sight. However, when Ethero and his compatriots encounter an artificial life form named Titania, the other inhabitants of his city are violently wiped out by the Empire's forces. Together, Ethero and Titania begin a quest to get his revenge and to stop a sinister Empire plot from developing, which, if not dealt with, could put everyone on the planet in jeopardy. The characters we are introduced to in the opening pages of Volume 1 are endearing and fun. In fact, most of the focus of these opening pages is on Ethero's compatriots. Having these seemingly lead characters get brutally murdered early on in the story is a great way to get us on board with Ethero's mission to defeat the Empire. As I've stated previously, the story of Aposimz is much easier to follow than those which adhere to Nihei's signature visual storytelling style. However, like every other work of his that I've read, Aposimz is chock full of Nihei's signature Nihei-isms, terms like regular frame, megastructure, and EBTG mechanism, proliferate the pages of his story. While it is much easier to get a general grasp of characters' goals and motivations in Aposimz than in Nihei's other works, the actual way that the world functions and the experiences of the characters' lives remain behind the veiled fog of Nihei's imagination. This story, which may be thousands upon thousands of years removed from our own world, if it even takes place within our universe at all, like many of Nihei's other works, contains characters operating on logic and dealing with circumstances that we couldn't possibly understand, and Nihei doesn't bother taking the time to ensure that we we do. Many of the specific underlying elements of how the world operates that are depicted in Aposimz are also depicted in Nihei's other works, and they bring about questions in the reader. Are these characters even really human? Are they machines? What exactly are the circumstances that led to the world being how it is? Constantly having these unanswered questions in the back of your mind as you read a Nihei work can be frustrating, but these questions and the experience of trying to develop educated guesses in response to them based off the very little concrete information we are given related to these topics is part of Nihei's appeal, in my opinion. Ethero and Titania, our leads, are both engaging enough, though their goals are admittedly much more interesting than they are. They are fine as characters. Ethero is a typical strong silent type, with seemingly nothing motivating him outside of revenge. The concept that seeking revenge may also prevent scores of deaths is seemingly incidental to him. Titania, on the other hand, acts as Ethero's guide and navigator, both in a literal and an abstract sense. She is interested in the more ephemeral aspects of their journey. Beyond these basic character traits, our leads so far have demonstrated very little in the way of actual personality. There are two elements to keep in mind in regards to this point. The first being that this review is only of the first 2 volumes of Aposimz, so the characters' personalities and their relationships with one another may develop further as the story continues. The second, something I alluded to earlier, is that Nihei's characters aren't really the appeal of his stories. It's the visuals, the world building, and the desire to try and parse whatever little information is given on the mysterious ways in which Nihei's universe works. While Nihei has definitely reined in his visual style significantly with Aposimz, he has also ramped up the level of intense, violent action that would be typically found in one of his stories. The action is gruesome, fun, and oftentimes very creative. While the visual world building of the typical Nihei story is not as frequently utilized in Aposimz, the use of heavy dialogue does do a fairly effective job at fleshing out the story in its own way. We are able to get a better sense of what's going on in the world and what the experience of living in this world is like from the dialogue, but we aren't able to get a visual understanding of the kind of world the characters inhabit, which in my view can be a more creative and fun way to establish world building. While Aposimz utilizes the same writing style as Nihei's other works and clearly inhabits the same world as his other stories, utilizing similar technology and specific visual elements, the art and the storytelling are very, very different. The action is fun, and questions of where the story will go from here are enough to want me to keep reading past volume 2. However, my desire to keep reading isn't that high. That's because the more traditional art style and framing, as well as a more dialogue heavy and overall straightforward story, coupled with the fact that our leads have yet to show anything in the way of engaging personality traits or chemistry with one another, leaves Aposimz feeling like a more traditional and generic narrative. I'm going to give volumes 1 and 2 of Aposimz a 6 out of 10.